This little girl is mocked for saying she can afford a hotel suite, but she makes a bet that causes something incredible. You won't believe what happens next. Comment, giving a rating from 0 to 10 for my story. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. The scream echoed through the cobblestone streets of the historic town like a sharp blade, cutting through the muggy afternoon air. The middle-aged businessman nearly spilled his coffee as he stepped away from the window of his luxurious apartment. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the clapboard house across the street, a faded yellow two-story building with peeling blue window frames that contrasted with the elegance of the modern condo where he lived. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, adjusting his tie before returning to work. As the owner of one of the largest construction companies in the region, he was used to solving complex problems, but he preferred to keep his distance from other people's dramas, especially after 5 years of living alone. Since he lost his wife on a rainy night he preferred not to remember. His fortune had been built with careful investments in the stock market, but money had never filled the void left by her departure. He kept part of his wealth in bitcoins and various investments, but no asset in the world could buy back what he had lost. Across the street, inside the clapboard house, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her age insufficient to understand why her aunt hated her so much. The woman in her early 30s tightly held a metal spoon she had heated on the electric stove, her eyes red from the booze fixed on the child who trembled before her. "You're a curse on this house," the aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the cheap whiskey she'd been drinking since noon. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin arms. The child bit her lip to avoid screaming louder. She had learned that screams only enraged her aunt more, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember the soft voice of her mother, singing that song before going to sleep. It was all that remained of her now. Fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Stop whimpering," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon in the drawer as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you mess up the walls again with that dirty charcoal, you'll see what real punishment is." The child ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a cross on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum softly her mother's song, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that, across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she cooked, a popular song about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the clapboard house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that touched a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. In the house next door to the clapboard one, the retired schoolteacher in her early 60s was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her heart clench. How strange, she thought, watching the windows of the neighboring house, a family she had known for decades. The aunt had always been troubled, but since she took custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in town. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had properly talked to her, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little child better. Meanwhile, the businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories that he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of a former employee who had abruptly resigned 5 years ago, a few months before the accident. She was a kind woman, always humming while organizing the construction company's files. Then suddenly she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again, until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to suffer in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains surrounding the town when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers tightened on the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the businessman closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what happened beyond his own windows. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical movement of the historic town awakening to another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that didn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the clapboard house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a puffy face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's binge. "Good morning," said the teacher with her gentlest smile. "I came to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've talked properly." The aunt hesitated, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, Mrs. Davis, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The teacher took a step forward, forcing the woman to retreat. "And I would very much like to meet your niece. I heard she's a lovely girl." The aunt's face hardened for a moment before forcing a weak smile. "The girl is sick. High fever. Better not get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher perked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Maybe I can help," insisted the educator. "I have experience with sick children. I raised 3 children. You know how it is." "No need, no," replied the aunt quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a flu. It will pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol that emanated from her even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while having breakfast. He'd woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams where the voice of a child mixed with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the clapboard house, a strange curiosity invaded him. The educator finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not before casting an investigative look into the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the clapboard house, the aunt locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouched behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in the room?" the aunt growled, the irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Aunt," the girl mumbled, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the yard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high fences and dominated by a single maple tree. There, she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the electric stove. They were always birds, small, big, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the child in the yard under the strong midday sun. The girl began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. Then she began to sing softly her mother's song, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar in that voice, in that specific song. He took his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. While recording, fragments of memories began to fit into his mind. His former employee hummed that same song while working. She always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl named... "Same song," murmured the businessman, the cell phone trembling in his hands, the employee who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made that connection before? The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the kind woman who had worked for him for years. He vaguely remembered her mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems in the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, that woman's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt the businessman carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including the regret for not having helped when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, punctually, the screams started again. This time, the businessman didn't turn away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the clapboard house he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He took his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently towards a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the businessman couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. His financial investments and all his net worth meant nothing in the face of that child's suffering. The question now was, what would he do with this information? His passive income and all the dividends he received monthly seemed insignificant compared to the responsibility he felt growing in his chest. That night, the girl slept on the ground in the yard, where the aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the maple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's departure. His possessions and assets seemed useless in the face of the urgency of that situation. 3 days passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and the guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During these days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 in the afternoon, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering a few meters from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the neighboring clapboard house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting a new direct visit to the aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from which she had the best view of the backyard of the clapboard house. What she saw horrified her. The girl was sitting under the maple tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing in the dirt with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "Oh my God," the educator whispered, her hands trembling as she gripped the fence separating the yards. It was worse than she imagined. Much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," said the girl in her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, sweetie," replied the teacher, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you all right?" The child glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. I'm just drawing birdies." "That's nice. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," replied the girl, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the teacher's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Where are you, girl?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend that she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could see the neighboring yard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him nauseous. For the first time in 5 years, he felt genuine rage burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family who lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. All his capital accumulated over the years, his profits and investments in gold, seemed insignificant in the face of that moral responsibility that now weighed on his shoulders. At 11 in the morning, the teacher made a courageous decision. She put on her best dress suit, took a tray of homemade cookies that she had prepared as a pretext, and went again to the clapboard house. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's insistence. "Mrs. Davis, I already told you it's not a good time." "Honey, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," the educator interrupted firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little one better. As old neighbors, it is our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom had given her. The interior of the clapboard house was dark and smelled of mold mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," the aunt lied, blocking the way to the back of the house. "That's a shame." "Maybe another time then," said the teacher, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the electric stove, and especially small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The teacher and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbor's cat," the aunt said quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The teacher smiled and nodded, but had decided she had seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always right next door if you need anything at all." The educator's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the teacher left, the aunt locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl huddled behind the electric stove, trying to hide. The child had cried when she heard the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," accused the aunt, her eyes already shining with familiar rage. "No, Aunt, I didn't make noise," protested the girl, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt grabbed the metal spoon that was on the electric stove and put it directly in the heating element. The child recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to get attention, don't you?" hissed the aunt as the spoon heated up. "Want the neighbors to come here and ask questions? You think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone at the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated worker who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. All his investment funds and accumulated treasure were worth nothing if he couldn't protect a defenseless child. While the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the businessman made a call he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend. "Robert, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the child's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it might be a matter of life or death." The lawyer's voice immediately became serious. "Tell me everything. What's happening?" "I have evidence of severe child abuse. Videos, audios. The child is the daughter of a former employee of mine who passed away. She is being tortured by the aunt who is supposed to take care of her." "We need to act immediately," said Robert. "With evidence like that, we can contact Child Protective Services today. Can you come to my office now?" That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to slip quietly into the yard. Her new burns stung, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the maple tree and looked at the stars, humming softly her mother's song. What she didn't know was that, for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering. And that, in the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. Across the street, the businessman had finally found the courage to turn his wealth into something that really mattered: the salvation of an innocent child. The lawyer arrived at the businessman's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at the university for almost 3 decades, and Robert knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," said Robert, sitting in the spacious living room of the apartment. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." The businessman poured coffee and positioned himself next to the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being mistreated by the aunt who's taking care of her. Mistreated how? Asked Robert, taking a notepad out of his briefcase. Burns, daily screams, neglect. The businessman paused, struggling with the words. I have recordings, Robert, evidence of what's happening. Robert was silent for a moment, processing the information. That's very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately. I know, replied the businessman, running his hands over his face. But there's something else. My former employee worked for me for 3 years. She quit abruptly a few years ago, a few months before my wife's accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible, completed Robert, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with this woman. At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and Robert could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. Does this happen every day? He asked, horrified. At 3 in the afternoon, religiously, but sometimes also at other times, replied the businessman, picking up his cell phone. Do you want to see the recordings? Robert watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the district attorney. This child needs to be removed from that house immediately. While the 2 men planned the intervention across the street, the girl was living another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol at home. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the early morning. How many times do I have to tell you not to mess up the walls? Shouted the aunt, holding the girl by the arm hard enough to leave marks. You're a plague, a curse on this house. The child tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you, continued the aunt, pushing the girl down the hall. And if I hear even a peep, you'll know a punishment you've never experienced before. The room where the child was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to sing softly her mother's song, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten she existed. It was this song that the retired teacher heard when she passed by the house on her way to the grocery store. The educator had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, about the marks she had seen on the child's arms, about the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. The teacher stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but filled with a sadness that broke the educator's heart. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the grocery store, the teacher went directly to the town center, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the counselor well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. Anna, I need to talk to you about a very serious situation, said the teacher, entering the office without ceremony. The counselor looked up from the papers she was analyzing. Mrs. Davis, how good to see you. What brings you here today? A child in danger, my neighbor. I'm sure she's being mistreated. The counselor straightened up in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her years as a child welfare worker, She had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and Mrs. Davis was not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," said Anna, picking up a complaint form. While the teacher reported her observations across town, Robert was in a similar meeting in the district attorney's office. The prosecutor listened attentively as the lawyer presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is compelling evidence," said the prosecutor, examining the videos on Robert's cell phone. "I'm going to order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will that take?" asked Robert, worried. "With this evidence, we can act today," replied the prosecutor. "I'm going to contact Child Protective Services now." That's how, by a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, two simultaneous complaints arrived at Child Protective Services on the same morning. Anna was finishing noting the teacher's account when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services, Anna speaking." "Anna, this is the prosecutor. I need you to make an urgent intervention at a house on Colonial Row. We have evidence of serious child abuse." Anna paused, the pen suspended over the paper. "Is it by chance the yellow clapboard house?" "Exactly. How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," replied Anna, looking at the teacher with surprise. "Two independent sources. This confirms the seriousness of the situation." At 2 p.m, a coordinated operation was being set up. Anna, accompanied by 2 social workers and a law enforcement officer, was heading to Colonial Row. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. Robert was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," said Robert, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the businessman, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the clapboard house. In the house, the aunt had gone out to buy alcohol, leaving the child locked in the stuffy room. The girl continued singing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When Anna knocked on the door of the clapboard house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside exceeded even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was the teacher who first heard the faint voice coming from the back room. "Someone's here," she said, guiding the team down the hallway. When they opened the door to the room and found the girl huddled in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child raised her big, frightened eyes, not understanding who those people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, sweetie," said Anna, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Anna. We're here to help you." The girl looked at the teacher, recognizing the kind lady who had talked to her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fear. "Aunt will be mad," she whispered. "You don't need to worry about that now," said the teacher, reaching out her hand to the girl. "We're going to get you out of here, okay?" 6 months later, on a sunny morning, the girl was running freely in the yard of her new home, a temporary foster home carefully chosen by the social worker, where a loving family had welcomed her with genuine affection. Her wounds had healed, her smile had returned, and she sang her mother's song now not as a lament, but as a celebration of life. The businessman, who had used a significant portion of his wealth to ensure that the child had access to the best medical and psychological care, visited regularly. He had discovered that truly helping was more rewarding than accumulating dividends. His financial assets finally had a greater purpose. The retired teacher had become a volunteer at Child Protective Services, using her experience to identify other children at risk. And the girl, little by little, was learning that the world could be a safe place, where kind people existed to protect and love her. Her aunt had been permanently removed from her care and was receiving treatment for her addiction, while the child blossomed in an environment where she would never again know the pain that had marked her early years. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.